The dinner rush at Carmelo's had been relentless for 3 hours straight, and Anna Russo's feet ached with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from standing on cheap linoleum in worn-out shoes while carrying trays heavy enough to strain her shoulders. The restaurant was packed wall to wall with the Friday night crowd, couples celebrating anniversaries, families with screaming children who threw pasta on the floor, businessmen who snapped their fingers for refills and left terrible tips. And Anna moved through the chaos with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for far too long. Her white blouse was stained with marinara sauce from an earlier mishap. Her dark hair was escaping from its bun in sweaty tendrils that stuck to her neck, and her forced smile felt like it had been painted on her face with industrial adhesive that was slowly cracking under the strain. She had been working double shifts for 6 weeks now, ever since her mother's diagnosis had transformed their lives into a nightmare of medical bills and specialist appointments, and the crushing weight of watching someone you loved slowly deteriorate. The restaurant job paid barely above minimum wage, but it was steady work with tips that could sometimes push her weekly earnings into something approaching livable, and Anna couldn't afford to be picky when her mother's medication cost more per month than their rent. So she smiled through the exhaustion and the rude customers, and the way her manager Tony looked at her like she was something he wanted to consume, because quitting meant losing the health insurance that was the only thing keeping her mother alive. Table 12 had been a problem since the moment the four men sat down. Loud and already drunk, their voices carrying across the restaurant with the aggressive confidence of people who believed the world existed to serve their entertainment. Anna had recognized the type immediately: businessmen from out of town, wearing expensive suits and designer watches, treating the restaurant staff like props in their evening of excess. They had ordered the most expensive items on the menu, sent back their steaks twice for being either overcooked or undercooked depending on which one was complaining, and made increasingly crude comments every time Anna approached their table. She was delivering their fourth round of drinks when the hand grabbed her, fingers closing around her wrist with enough pressure to make her drop the tray. Glass shattered against the floor in an explosion of sound that made the nearby tables fall silent. And suddenly, Anna was being pulled down into the lap of the man at the head of the table, middle-aged with thinning hair and alcohol-bright eyes, his breath hot and sour against her face as he laughed at her struggle. "Come on, sweetheart," he slurred, his other hand sliding up her thigh with proprietary confidence. "Don't be unfriendly. We're spending a lot of money here. The least you, could do is be nice to us." Anna's training screamed at her to stay calm, to de-escalate, to remember that the customer was always right, and losing her temper meant losing her job. But her body responded before her rational mind could catch up, every self-defense instinct honed from years of navigating a world that viewed young women as fair game, overriding her professional restraint. She drove her elbow back into the man's solar plexus, hard enough to make him grunt with pain and release her, then scrambled off his lap with her heart hammering and her hands shaking with adrenaline and fury. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice coming out harder and colder than she had intended. "Keep your hands to yourself, or I'm calling the police." The man's expression transformed from amused to enraged in the space of a heartbeat, his face flushing red as he rose from his chair with his fist clenched. "You little... Is there a problem here?" The voice that cut through the tension came from behind Anna, deep and controlled, and carrying an authority that made everyone at table 12 freeze. Anna turned to find a man standing close enough that she could smell his cologne. Expensive and subtle, with notes of sandalwood and something darker, and feel the heat radiating from his body. He was tall and broad-shouldered, beneath a perfectly tailored black suit, his dark hair styled in a way that suggested professional attention, and his face was all sharp angles and controlled expressions that revealed nothing of what he might be thinking. But it was his eyes that made Anna's breath catch, dark and intense, and currently fixed on the drunk businessman, with the kind of cold assessment that suggested he was measuring the man for a coffin. "This is none of your business," the drunk man said, but there was uncertainty creeping into his voice now, some instinct warning him that he had miscalculated something important. The bitch dropped our drinks and— "Watch your language," the man said quietly, and somehow the calm delivery made the words more threatening rather than less. He moved slightly, positioning himself between Anna and table 12, with a deliberateness that suggested military training or something equally disciplined. "You grabbed her. She defended herself. Now you're going to pay your bill and leave, and you're going to leave a generous tip for the woman you assaulted. Or I can make this evening significantly more unpleasant for all of you." The drunk businessman looked like he wanted to argue, but something in the stranger's expression must have convinced him this was not a fight he could win. He threw several bills on the table, with enough force to scatter them across the surface, grabbed his coat, and stalked toward the exit with his companions scrambling to follow. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal noise level as other diners went back to their meals, the brief entertainment over. Anna found herself staring at the man who had intervened, her adrenaline still pumping, and her professional mask completely shattered. "Thank you," she managed, her voice shakier than she would have liked. "You didn't have to do that." The man turned to face her fully, and Anna watched something shift in his expression as his eyes moved over her face, the careful control giving way to something that looked almost like concern. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine." Anna wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly acutely aware of how she must look, disheveled and exhausted, with broken glass at her feet, and the mark of fingers already forming a bruise on her wrist, where the drunk man had grabbed her. "It's not the first time something like this has happened. Comes with the job." "It shouldn't," the man said, and there was something almost angry in his voice, despite the calm delivery. No one should have to tolerate being grabbed and harassed as part of their employment. Tony appeared at Anna's elbow before she could respond, his expression oscillating between concern for the disturbance and calculation about how to handle the situation without losing customers. "Anna, go clean yourself up. I'll handle table 12's mess. And sir," he turned to the man with an ingratiating smile that made Anna's stomach turn. "Thank you for your intervention. Can I offer you a complimentary meal? Our finest table?" "I have a table," the man said, his gaze moving past Tony to fix on Anna again. "But I would appreciate it if you ensured your employee receives medical attention for her wrist and that she's not penalized for defending herself against assault." The way he phrased it, not as a request but as an expectation, made Tony's smile falter slightly, and Anna felt a small spark of satisfaction at seeing her manager uncertain for once. Of course. Anna, take a break. Get some ice for that wrist." Anna nodded and moved toward the back of the restaurant on autopilot, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. In the small break room, she collapsed onto a folding chair and pressed her shaking hands against her face, letting herself have 30 seconds of reaction before she would need to pull herself together and return to work. The way that man had positioned himself between her and danger, the cold authority in his voice when he told the drunk businessman to leave, the genuine concern in his eyes when he asked if she was hurt. It all felt surreal, like something from a movie, rather than her exhausting reality of double shifts and mounting bills and the slow erosion of hope. She was wrapping ice in a dish towel for her wrist when Maria, the other evening waitress, stuck her head into the break room with wide eyes. "Anna, do you know who that was? The man who helped you?" "No. Should I?" Maria glanced over her shoulder as though checking for eavesdroppers before moving closer and lowering her voice. "That's Lorenzo Marchetti. He owns half the buildings in this neighborhood. His family runs—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They run businesses. Important businesses. The kind that make people very careful about what they say and do around them." The implication hung in the air between them, and Anna felt something cold settle in her stomach. Organized crime. The man who had defended her, who had looked at her with concern and positioned himself between her and danger, was connected to the Mafia. She should have been frightened, should have been planning to avoid him for the rest of her shift. But instead, she found herself thinking about the way he had said no one should have to tolerate being grabbed and harassed, like her dignity and safety actually mattered. "He's been coming here every Friday for months," Maria continued, warming to her gossip. "Always sits at table 7, always orders the osso buco, always leaves an enormous tip, never causes problems, never makes demands, just eats and reads whatever paperwork he brings with him. But Anna," Maria's expression turned serious, "be careful around him. Men like that, they're dangerous even when they're being kind. Especially when they're being kind." Anna nodded and went back to work, though she found her gaze drifting repeatedly toward table 7, where Lorenzo Marchetti sat alone reading what appeared to be contracts or business documents. He looked up once, and their eyes met across the restaurant, and Anna felt her breath catch at the intensity of his attention before she quickly looked away and forced herself to focus on her other tables. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of exhaustion and hyper-awareness of Lorenzo's presence in the restaurant. Every time she walked past his table, she could feel his gaze tracking her movements, not in the predatory way Table 12 had leered at her, but with something that felt more like watchfulness, like he was ensuring no one else bothered her. When he finally asked for his check, Anna was surprised to find herself assigned to deliver it, despite Table 7 not being in her section. "Tony said I should handle your payment personally," she said as she approached his table, the lie obvious in her voice. Her manager had probably calculated that having Anna serve Lorenzo would smooth over any lingering tension from the earlier incident. "Your total is $87. Lorenzo pulled out his wallet and handed her $200 bills without looking at the check. "Keep the change, and Anna—" The use of her name startled her until she remembered she was wearing a name tag. "If anyone else bothers you, if any customer makes you uncomfortable, you call me immediately." He pulled a business card from his wallet and held it out to her. Plain black cardstock with embossed silver text, Lorenzo Marchetti, and a phone number. "I can't accept," Anna started, but Lorenzo interrupted gently. "Yes, you can. Take it. Put it in your phone. If you need help, you call that number. Any time, day, or night. Someone will answer." Anna took the card with shaking fingers, her mind providing a dozen reasons why accepting help from a man connected to organized crime was a terrible idea. But she thought about the bruise forming on her wrist, about the way Table 12 had laughed while grabbing her, about the exhausting reality of being young and female and vulnerable in a world that viewed those characteristics as weaknesses to exploit. "Why are you doing this?" Lorenzo stood, and suddenly Anna was very aware of how much bigger he was than her, how the expensive suit did nothing to disguise the lean strength of his build or the controlled power in the way he moved. "Because someone needs to protect you," he said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "And it appears that no one else is doing it adequately." Then he was gone, moving through the restaurant toward the exit, and Anna stood frozen by table 7, holding his business card and feeling like something fundamental had just shifted in her life. The card stayed in her wallet for 2 weeks before she used it, tucked behind her driver's license like a talisman she didn't quite believe in. Lorenzo continued coming to the restaurant every Friday, always sitting at table 7, always ordering the osso buco, always leaving outrageous tips that Tony made sure went entirely to Anna, despite her protests that she shouldn't be getting special treatment. He never approached her directly again, beyond polite greetings when she delivered his meal. But Anna could feel his attention, tracking her movements through every shift, could sense him watching for signs that someone else was bothering her. It should have made her uncomfortable. This constant surveillance from a dangerous man who had decided for reasons she didn't understand that she was worth protecting. But instead, Anna found herself relaxing into the knowledge that someone was paying attention, that if another Table 12 situation occurred, Lorenzo would intervene. It was the first time in years that she had felt safe while working, and she hated how much she had come to depend on that feeling. The night she finally called the number on his card started like any other closing shift. The restaurant had emptied by 11, and Anna was wiping down tables while counting her tips and calculating whether she had made enough to cover both the electricity bill and her mother's medication this month. The numbers weren't adding up the way she needed them to, and exhaustion was making it hard to think clearly enough to figure out where she could cut expenses. Her mother's next appointment with the specialist was in 3 days, and they still owed money from the last visit, and the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen made Anna jump, her heart suddenly racing. Tony was supposed to be in the back doing inventory, but the restaurant should have been empty otherwise. She moved toward the kitchen slowly, every instinct screaming at her to call the police or run or do anything except investigate. But before she could decide, Maria stumbled through the swinging door with blood streaming from a cut on her forehead and terror written across her face. "Anna, run!" Maria gasped, reaching for her with shaking hands. "There's someone!" 2 men emerged from the kitchen behind Maria, both wearing ski masks and carrying crowbars, and Anna's training as a waitress vanished completely in the face of real danger. She grabbed Maria's hand and ran for the front door, her exhaustion forgotten in the surge of adrenaline, but one of the masked men was faster. He caught Anna's arm and yanked her backward hard enough that she lost her footing and crashed into a table, sending dishes and silverware clattering to the floor. "The safe!" the man growled, his breath hot against her ear. "Tell us where the manager keeps the safe, and no one gets hurt." Anna's mind went blank with fear, her body frozen despite the way every rational thought screamed at her to fight or flee or do something. She could feel Maria sobbing somewhere nearby, could hear Tony shouting from the kitchen, could smell the sweat and aggression radiating from the man holding her. And suddenly, without conscious decision, her hand was fumbling for her phone in her apron pocket, her fingers finding the business card she had programmed into her contacts 2 weeks ago, pressing the call button and praying that Lorenzo had meant it when he said she could reach him any time. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Not Lorenzo, but someone who sounded younger and rougher around the edges. "Who is this?" "My name is Anna Russo," she gasped, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush while the masked man searched her pockets for keys. "Lorenzo gave me this number. I'm at Carmelo's restaurant on 10th Street, and there are men with weapons." The man yanked the phone from her hand and threw it against the wall hard enough to shatter it, then grabbed her by the hair and pulled her head back at an angle that made her neck scream with pain. "Stupid girl, that's not going to help you." But 15 minutes later, when the masked men were still tearing apart Tony's office looking for the safe, when Anna and Maria were tied to chairs with duct tape across their mouths, when Anna had resigned herself to whatever was about to happen, the front door of the restaurant exploded inward, with enough force to tear it from its hinges. Lorenzo came through first, moving with a speed and violence that seemed impossible for someone his size, and behind him were 3 other men who moved with the same controlled aggression. The masked men never stood a chance. Within seconds, both were on the ground, with Lorenzo's men restraining them with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested this was not their first time dealing with threats. Lorenzo moved through the wreckage of the restaurant toward Anna, his dark eyes blazing with fury that transformed his usually controlled features into something genuinely terrifying. "Who did this?" he demanded, his gaze moving over the duct tape and the bindings with an expression that promised violence. "Who tied you up?" Anna couldn't answer through the duct tape, could only watch as Lorenzo pulled a knife from somewhere inside his jacket and carefully cut through her restraints, his movements controlled despite the rage visible in every line of his body. When the tape came off her mouth, Anna gasped for breath and found tears streaming down her face despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, the words barely intelligible. "I'm sorry I called. I know I shouldn't have bothered you, but I didn't know what else to do, and Maria was bleeding, and they had weapons and—" "Stop," Lorenzo said firmly, his hands framing her face with surprising gentleness, given the fury still burning in his eyes. "Stop apologizing. You did exactly what you should have done. You called me, and I came. That's what that number was for, Anna. That's why I gave it to you." His men were hauling the masked intruders toward the door, and Anna heard one of them say something in Italian that made Lorenzo's expression harden even further. "Take them to the warehouse," Lorenzo said without looking away from Anna. "I'll deal with them later. Right now, I need to make sure everyone here is safe." An ambulance arrived for Maria and Tony, who had been pistol-whipped when he tried to fight the intruders, and police appeared to take statements and photographs. Lorenzo stood beside Anna through all of it, his presence a solid anchor in the chaos, and she found herself leaning against him despite every reason she could think of why depending on a man connected to organized crime was dangerous. When the police finally finished their questions and the ambulance had taken Maria to the hospital, Lorenzo guided Anna outside to where his car was parked, a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than Anna would earn in 5 years. "I'm taking you home," he said, opening the passenger door for her. "You're not staying here another minute." "I should help clean up," Anna protested weakly, but she was already sliding into the passenger seat, her body making the decision her exhausted mind couldn't manage. "And I need to check on Maria, and—" "I'll handle all of that," Lorenzo interrupted gently, closing her door and moving around to the driver's seat. "Right now, you need to go home and rest. Where do you live?" Anna gave him her address with a sense of unreality, like this was happening to someone else, and she was just observing from a distance. The drive through the dark streets passed in silence, and Anna found herself watching Lorenzo's profile in the dim light from the dashboard. The strong line of his jaw, the controlled way he handled the car, the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested the fury from earlier hadn't entirely dissipated. "Why did you help me?" Anna heard herself ask when they were stopped at a red light. "You barely know me. I'm just a waitress at a restaurant you happen to frequent. Why would you drop everything and come rescue me?" Lorenzo's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching before he turned to look at her with an expression that was complicated and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "Because from the moment I watched you handle that drunk businessman 2 weeks ago, watched you defend yourself and refuse to be treated like you were less than human, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. Because you work 2 jobs to pay for your mother's medical treatment, and you carry yourself with dignity despite the exhaustion and the stress and the constant threat of harassment. Because when I look at you, Anna, I see someone worth protecting. Someone worth—" He stopped himself, but Anna understood what he had been about to say. Someone worth caring about. Someone worth more than he had probably allowed himself to feel for anyone in a long time. The light turned green, and Lorenzo returned his attention to driving, but the words hung in the air between them, changing something fundamental in the space they occupied. When they reached Anna's building, a modest 3-story walk-up in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, Lorenzo insisted on walking her to her door. The building didn't have an elevator, and climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor made Anna's exhaustion crash over her with renewed force. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't get her key in the lock, and Lorenzo gently took the keys from her and unlocked the door himself. The apartment was small and shabby, but clean, with second-hand furniture and photographs on the walls and the faint medicinal smell that came from her mother's room down the hall. Anna moved into the tiny living room and collapsed onto the couch, her professional mask finally crumbling completely under the weight of everything that had happened. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, pressing her hands against her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I can't work double shifts at a restaurant where customers grab me and masked men break in with weapons. I can't keep fighting to pay medical bills that keep getting bigger while my mother gets sicker. I can't." Her voice broke on a sob, and suddenly Lorenzo was sitting beside her on the couch, pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about men who operated in his world. "Then don't," he said quietly, one hand moving in slow circles on her back, while she cried into his expensive suit. "Quit the restaurant. Let me help you find something safer. Let me help with your mother's medical bills. Let me—" "I can't accept your money," Anna interrupted, pulling back to look at him through tear-blurred vision. I don't even know you. And what you do, the business you're in, I can't be involved in. That. I can't accept help that comes from illegal activities. Lorenzo's expression tightened, with something that looked like pain, but he nodded slowly. I understand. But Anna, the money I would give you isn't from illegal activities. My family owns legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction companies, real estate holdings. The money is clean, even if the reputation isn't. And I'm not asking you to be involved in anything dangerous. I'm just asking you to let me help someone who clearly needs it and who deserves better than what she's currently getting. Anna stared at him, her exhausted mind trying to process the offer and all its implications. Accepting help from Lorenzo meant creating a connection to him, meant owing him something she might not be able to repay, meant entering a world she had spent her entire life avoiding. But it also meant her mother could get proper medical care without Anna sacrificing her health and safety to pay for it. It meant she could stop working double shifts at a restaurant where harassment was considered part of the job. It meant she might actually have a chance to breathe instead of drowning in debt and exhaustion. I need to think about it, she finally said, and Lorenzo nodded as though he had expected that answer. Take all the time you need, but Anna. He pulled out another business card and pressed it into her hand. This number goes directly to my personal phone, not to an associate, not to an answering service. Me. If you need anything, if you're in danger, if you just want to talk, you call me. Will you promise me that? Anna looked at the card, then at Lorenzo's face with its careful control barely masking genuine concern, and found herself nodding. I promise. Lorenzo left after making her promise to lock the door and call him if anything felt wrong, and Anna sat in her quiet apartment, holding his business card and wondering how her life had become so complicated in the span of a few hours. She checked on her mother, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the violence her daughter had faced earlier, and then collapsed into her own bed, with her mind racing too fast for sleep. 2 days later, Anna returned to Carmelo's to officially quit and collect her final paycheck. Tony tried to convince her to stay, offering a minor raise that wouldn't have made a difference, but Anna's decision was made. The restaurant held too many bad memories now, and she needed a clean break from the constant anxiety that came with serving an unpredictable public. What she would do for work next, how she would pay her bills without the restaurant income, those were problems for tomorrow. Today, she was simply walking away from a job that had slowly been destroying her. Lorenzo was waiting for her outside the restaurant when she emerged with her final paycheck and her bag of personal items from her locker. He stood beside his car in another expensive suit, his dark eyes tracking her approach with an intensity that made her heart rate pick up despite her exhaustion. I heard you quit, he said without preamble. I also heard Tony tried to get you to stay by offering you 75 cents more per hour, which is insulting considering what you were worth to that place. Anna couldn't help but smile at the indignation in his voice. How do you already know all this? I quit 20 minutes ago. I have friends who pay attention, Lorenzo said, and there was something almost sheepish in his expression. I wanted to make sure you were okay, and I wanted to offer you something. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out to her. A job offer. Nothing related to my family's other interests, I promise. Completely legitimate, with benefits and reasonable hours and a salary that will actually let you live instead of just survive. Anna took the envelope with shaking hands, opening it to find a formal job offer for an administrative assistant position at one of Lorenzo's real estate companies. The salary listed was 3 times what she had been making at the restaurant, and the benefits package included health insurance that would cover her mother's specialists. Why? Anna asked, looking up at him with tears burning in her eyes. Why are you doing all this for me? Lorenzo stepped closer, and suddenly the distance between them felt charged with something that made Anna's breath catch. Because from the moment I watched you defend yourself against that drunk businessman, you've been all I can think about. Because you're brave and strong, and you deserve someone in your corner fighting for you instead of you fighting alone all the time. And because he paused, his hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted his dangerous reputation. Because I'm falling in love with you, Anna. I know that's insane after only 2 weeks, and I know I'm probably the last man on earth you should trust, but I can't stop myself from wanting to protect you and help you and be whatever you need me to be. Anna stared at him, her heart pounding, and her mind racing through 1,000 objections and complications and reasons why this was impossible. But she thought about the way he had dropped everything to rescue her, about the genuine concern in his eyes when he cut through her restraints, about the way he had held her while she cried on her couch. She thought about the job offer that would save her mother's life and her own sanity, and she thought about the way her chest expanded with warmth every time he looked at her like she mattered. "I'm not falling in love with you," she said quietly, watching his expression start to close down before she continued. "I'm already there. Which terrifies me, Lorenzo, because I know what you are, what your family does, and I know accepting your help means entering a world I don't understand. But I'm tired of fighting alone. I'm tired of pretending I'm strong enough to handle everything by myself. So yes, yes, to the job offer, and yes to whatever this is that's growing between us, even though it's probably crazy." Lorenzo's smile transformed his face, making him look years younger and infinitely less dangerous. He pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made Anna forget about every complication and danger and reason this was a terrible idea. In his arms, with the job offer clutched in her hand and the promise of his protection surrounding her like armor, Anna allowed herself to believe that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the bravest thing you could do was accept help from a dangerous man who whispered, "Someone needs to protect her," and actually meant it.